Music is a transposition and even an interpretation of the imagination. The process begins with elucubrations within cerebral circumvolutions and their interpretation into musical combinations of consecutive pitches. These are conditioned by progressive nurturing as subjects or societal ethnical groups. They developed and become incrementally and cumulatively subjected and often submitted to the dictate of autocratic cultural conventions. Collectively, these establish a conjunction between the auditory, when sounds are not only emitted by the voice, but are also sounds produced from instruments which are extensions of the voice, hence amounting to the haptical, where sensations of touch are conflated with the neuronal psychological nature of various pitches. Hence, the reflexive and immediate connection of the ethereal imagination to instrumental haptics, such as the fingers on the neck of a lute, on the keys of a keyboard, and with hybridization, such as with wind instruments, where the haptical is conjoined to the physical, haptical with fingers, dynamical with the throat, as seen on one Assyrian slab, where a singer is seen holding their throat while singing. Thus, we have established a reflexive connection between the imaginative and the haptical. This is particularly axiomatic with improvisations which are seminal expressions of early mankind, and later with improvisations which remain, nevertheless, the consequence of acculturations to a level dependent on the nature of the subject. Seminal improvisations, as we hear them from young children yet unspoilt, or reasonably unspoilt by nurturing, are probably the best example of acultural, that is, deprived of cultural influences, expressions. Thus, the theorizations of music is the consequence of both nurturing through culturation and acculturation, that is, the creolizations or adoption of other cultures, and it is not a phenomenon of any neuronal acultural thetical hierarchization of sounds, as is generally thought. Mankind has no unconscious predilection for any specific interval, simultaneous or consecutive. Therefore, theory is not the consequence of an unconscious intervallic predilection. It is a conscious phenomenon which arises with the nature of societal ethnical groups, where the phenomenon of synchronization, that is, when a group of individuals follows the melody of a dominant lead singer, as heard in some funerary dirges in the Cameroon, for example, or with the Moroccan Nauba, where a leading musician begins a melody, progressively followed individually and consecutively by the other musicians, in what could initially be construed as cacophony, but where, through the phenomenon of synchronization, will progressively end up into monadical coherence. We take it that the earliest musical utterances of mankind were developments from utterances of their earliest homonyms, from the Australopithecines, the early Homo, such as the Homo habilis, before becoming Homo erectus, around 2 million years from present. The question is, which came first? Was it language or music? The answer is that probably they came both mingled into one form of tonal, phonal expression, such as, for example, with the Manipuri language having 2 tones, perhaps 3, with particular tonal phonological characteristics such as dissimilatory processes, where an aspirated consonant, should I say, is deaspirated by another consonant. But I would say that performative utterances would have implicated specific archaic tonal phonal patterns that Austin called illocutionary acts. Then performative utterances are neither true or false. They are not truth evaluable. When something is wrong, they are unhappy, and when nothing is wrong, they are happy, with a tonal phonal following, with inflections reflecting the unhappy and the happy as today, with a significant degenerescence of the grammar of language. The voices rise in pitch for stressing interrogation without the grammatical convention. You happy? With the P of happy raised by a quantity depending on the level of happiness requested. Used instead of the locution, are you happy? Which, while questioning happiness, does not imply the level of happiness, since in this grammatical case the tonal phonal P is restricted. Then Searle assumes that language stems from an intrinsic intentionality of the mind, to which I would add that this would be true with the tonal phonal of that intrinsic intentionality of the mind. Now, Derrida values the distinctiveness of every speech art because it has a specific effect on the particular situation in which it is performed that Derrida calls the possibility of repeating a text as iterability, or the ability to repeat. I would suggest that the tonal phonal follows the same rule. The first textual intonation would have been expressed more like portamento, continuous slide from one tonal phonal to another without articulating the pitch phonemes in between. Then we have the portato, slightly detached notes, somewhere between legato and staccato, then legato, and lastly staccato. But it is all much more complicated, and I'm not pretending to be an expert in these linguistic fields, but just an inquisitive observer. Thus, the practice of portamento, better known to music theory as melismatic expressions, would have been followed by polysyllabism, then by a pneumatic form, when a syllable would have had 2 or 3 many contiguous pitches, and then all became syllabic when a clear distinction came with 1 syllable per pitch. This is when mankind went through a radical change in the melodic phenomenon. It goes without saying that these 3 periods of melodic morphology, portamento, pneumatic, and syllabic, spread through tens of thousands of years, and that transitions would have been imperceptible evolutions. But what was the motivation for melodic sound emission? Again, and firstly, I see it as an unconscious reflexive phenomenon. Pain is accompanied by unconscious shouting to levels which are unconsciously proportional to the level of pain. Pleasure responds to the same rule. The voicing of pleasure is proportional to the unconscious amount of pleasure received. The voicing of request, however, does not operate in the same manner, since it is not an unconscious reflexive action, but it is a conscious expression which operates as a conscious demonstration, which is proportional to the level of the request. Thus we have 2 clearly defined seminal melodic phenomena, the unconscious and the conscious. Then there would have been variations on these 3 with more and more specific monosyllables or polysyllables. These three utterances progressively led to grammatical and syntactical elements which would have progressively grown unconsciously and consciously in the context of specific environmental and societal circumstances. Secondly, some argue that the phenomenon of melodic sound emission would have come from mimicry, or the imitation of birds singing. But do birds really sing, or are they simply emitting patterns unrelated to any emotion? They do not produce sounds of any recognized temperament or scales, with the exception of certain species. Mostly birds use repeating acoustic motifs rather than human-like musical scales. However, the hermit thrush may be an exception with a display using the harmonic series. However, this would be the consequence of their anatomical disposition of what would be their larynx. Among samples of songbird species, 8 basic acoustic motifs were isolated. They are structural building blocks, not scales. For instance, slow trills are heard with the northern cardinal, whose acoustic motif is territorial. Flat whistles with 3-vaulted bellbird, ultrafast trills with the Bohemian waxwing, and harmonic stacks with many other species. These motifs are shaped by biology and environment. Some have further argued that birds do not use human scale because they do not divide the octave into fixed intervals, as if all music depended on the octave. This is the most extraordinary, absurd proposition. About so-called bird songs, or rather acoustic sequences, being produced from non-equal temperament, non-Western scales, non-just intonation, and others, I would contend that, after all, they might have been the possible source of spontaneous unconscious mimicry, as early hominids would not have been polluted by the aforementioned Western dictates or conventions, from which to compare the pitches of ornithological sequences. After all, bird acoustic sequences would have been easy to mimic since they are repetitive. However, there are only few birds which offer clear and precise musical patterns, such as the great tit, with only 2 pitches in our sample, from C-sharp -11 cents to A7 -27 cents, or a kind of diminished 6. The common chiff-chaff with, again, in our sample, a predominance of a C-sharp -11 cents and an A-sharp, a kind of major 6. It is possible that birds emitting trills would also have led to mimicry, but there is no evidence about the accuracy with which hominids would have reproduced these patterns. However, it is reasonably safe to assume that from mimicry, humankind would have produced sequences of their own. These patterns would have carried meaningful sequences of syllables, which were repeated, and with time, with different syllables, with other meanings, the verse or the storytelling section, perhaps sung by the lead singer and the chorus, typically the emotional nucleus which members of a group would remember. This form traveled through time and to this day remains the principal structure of folkloric music. This pattern would have been the distant origins of phrasing, then of the structure of musical bars. The square, dancing, as there must have been an association of the 3 elements, text, music, and dance, still practiced to this day in world folklore.